Next up, we have Druid. We're joined by special guest Shiro, who is not an imprisoned Shiro. He is a free Shiro. He's not dormant. He only goes dormant briefly at nighttime, and then wakes up in a furious rage. When Shiro awakens, his trigger is to bork furiously until he is fed breakfast. Imprisoned Satyr, though, is a 3-cost 3/3 that's dormant for 2 turns. When it awakens, it reduces the cost of a random minion in your hand by 5. This is one of the cards that was revealed fairly early on. And I think this card is pretty interesting. Obviously, in any kind of ramp deck, this can be very effective. It is a pretty dangerous effect when you're spending 3 mana doing absolutely nothing. And drawing this card late in the game can be extremely weak. But if you're able to ramp out a very big, very powerful minion, this can obviously have a pretty huge effect in terms of swinging the board. Shiro looks like he is going back to be dormant. You wanna go back to being dormant, Shiro? There you go. I gotta restart the webcam. So overall, I don't think Imprisoned Satyr seems super powerful to me. It seems like it is a card that kind of has some very high highs but very low lows. And I think that most of the time, if you want to play a ramp deck, you are probably happier to actually just use actual ramp cards than Imprisoned Satyr, especially because when you draw this late in the game, it literally does nothing. Unlike even a Wild Growth, where you can at least end up cycling it for a card. I guess it doesn't literally do nothing. You get a 3/3 body 2 turns later, but when you're actually in the late stages of the game, it seems like it'd be very, very weak. You can possibly try this with like a Malagos deck, and even in the late stage of the game, you play your Imprisoned Satyr, make it so that your hand only has Malagos in it to reduce, but that can take a very, very long time to set up. I do expect that if this does see play, it is in that style of combo deck that's trying to reduce the cost of a very specific card like Malagos. Next up, we have Fungal Fortunes. This is a 2-cost spell. Draw 3 cards, discard any minions drawn. Basically the opposite of Book of Specters. And Book of Specters, it was a card that saw quite a bit of play, even in decks with a significant number of spells, simply because that card draw is so powerful. One of the problems I see with Fungal Fortunes is that most decks, if they are very spell heavy, typically tend to have minions as well, and those minions are often very central to what the deck does. For instance, in like current versions of Reno Mage, there's no spell that you discard with Book of Specters that your deck just no longer functions. But if you're, say, playing Malagos Druid and you're like, well, I have tons of spells, I might as well play Fungal Fortunes, there's going to be a significant number of times when you Fungal Fortune discard your Malagos and your deck no longer functions. So frankly, I do think that's a good thing in terms of this card existing. I think that if this were just a extremely effective card draw effect for like a Malagos Druid deck, that would be very, very sad. And it definitely helps encourage other archetypes. He wants even more food. Shiro has awakened. Stopped. Shiro got his lunch like an hour ago. An hour and a half ago. There's not time to feed Shiro more. He just always wants more food. Alright, I'm just going to start this one over entirely because of the borking. Next up, we have Fungal Fortunes, which is sort of like an opposite Book of Specters. Draw 3 cards for 2 mana, discard any minions drawn. I do think that despite Book of Specters seeing a lot of play in decks that had a significant number of spells, like current versions of Reno Mage, Fungal Fortunes is kind of in a different spot because decks that contain a lot of spells and few minions often have those few minions as very central pieces of their combo. So losing, say, a Malygos in your Malygos Druid deck is a much bigger deal than losing like even your Conjurer's Calling or Lunate Paka's Galaxy in a current Reno Mage deck. So I feel like this is going to only really see play in very specifically focused spell-based Druid decks. Because you really need to not just throw away your only win condition. It's possible that you have versions of Spell Druid that are not so dependent on an individual card like a Malygos that still have a reasonable number of minions that just use Fungal Fortunes because it's a powerful card draw effect, but don't just lose the game if you discard that one specific minion. So I think this card is quite good. But I don't think it's quite the exact parallel with Book of Specters that some people seem to be making. Shiro's coming back down. I think he's going out now. Next up, we have Germination. 4-cost, summon a copy of a friendly minion, give the copy Taunt. This, I think, is more appealing to me than the Copy a Demon card that we saw in Demon Hunter for a couple of reasons. One, Fungal Fortunes makes it more appealing to play spell-based ways of generating board presence if you are playing a spell-heavy deck. Two, the fact that it gives a minion Taunt does mean that is more effective with a wider variety of stuff, isn't just narrowly applicable to copying specifically a demon, like the card in Demon Hunter. And also, Druid is a ramp class. Druid has a lot of ways to ramp out and get to play something and Germination it in the same turn, compared to something like Demon Hunter, in terms of the consistency with which you're able to actually get your sort of combination together. So, a bunch of card draw in the form of Fungal Fortunes, and like spell-based ways to generate minions go very well together, especially when you're ramping out. Next up, we have Overgrowth, which is very likely one of the most important cards in this set, I think. 4-cost, gain 2 empty mana crystals. This is extremely powerful ramp. Obviously, Nourish used to be 5 mana with the option of gaining 2 mana crystals, which were full mana crystals, which is important, or drawing cards. This is just the mana crystal option, but obviously, gaining mana crystals is very powerful. This ramps you, from 4 immediately to 7, which is a really big deal in your following turn. And the consistency with which you can ramp, if you're including Overgrowth, if you have Wild Growth, if you have Breath of Dreams, just a lot of ways to ramp out your mana in Standard. And I think we're going to see lots of Druid ramp decks. Given the presence of Overgrowth, you can go even bigger than you can with any of the stuff that only really ramped you a single mana before. So I think this card is very, very good, and we'll see a whole lot of play. Next up, we have Ysiel Windsinger. Your spells cost 1. 9 cost 5/5. This is very much like Aviana, which obviously made your minions cost 1. That was a 9 mana minion that became a 10 mana minion, got nerfed to that in Wild, thanks to the combination with Kuhn and just kind of going nuts. But yeah, in a world where you have lots of really big spells, like play this into Ultimate Infestation, it's actually not as powerful as it might seem, because you could obviously just do that with 10 mana anyway. And the fact that you can't play this into like Innervate, because your Innervate costs 1, makes it a lot less sort of swingy than it seems. I feel like this is a card that looks better than it is, even in a combo situation, because specifically of the fact that you can't really follow it up in the same turn with a bunch of additional mana generation, because it makes all your spells that cost mana, or spells that give you mana cost mana. So it kind of in a weird sort of bind there. You really need this to survive a turn. Like playing this into some big spell, you need to have this matter and survive the turn, or like your opponent having to react to it, costing them more tempo than they can afford in that turn, in order for this to really end up being all that powerful. Next up we have Ironbark. 2-cost card, give a minion +1/+3 and taunt. Costs 0 if you have at least 7 mana crystals. So the mana ramp theme coming in here. And this is sort of an interesting card. It's particularly scary with like Kael'thas. Kael'thas into Ironbark, into something huge is a very reasonable play. More things that cost 0 make Kael'thas style cards that much more scary. So this card is also just like, in the early game, okay, right? Obviously, Mark of the Wild doesn't see play at +2/+2 and taunt, but like this being something which you can play early that can later be a free spell, I think is actually very relevant. But obviously something that can be very powerful with like Wild Pyromancer in the late turns of the game with Gadgetzed Auctioneer. Frankly, I'm pretty happy that Acolyte of Pain got holo-famed, because Ironbark, Acolyte of Pain, Wild Pyromancer in the sort of late turns of the game would kind of go crazy. So yeah, I think this is an interesting card. It doesn't really feel like a card that a ramp deck wants itself unless it's doing combo-y things. But we'll see exactly how it sees play. Next up we have Marsh Hydra, a 7-cost 7/7 rush. After the attacks, add a random 8-cost minion to your hand. This is a really interesting card because a 7/7 rush for 7 isn't like crazy stat-wise, but it giving you a minion in a ramp deck for your next turn is kind of a big deal. If your deck is full of stuff like Breath of Dreams, Wild Growth, Overgrowth, a lot of times you just kind of have your big thing and then you don't have enough other stuff to go with it. There's no like ultimate infestation in standard right now or anything like that. So Marsh Hydra being a 7-cost reactive card that's also a threat that also generates another threat, it's kind of a combination of a bunch of things that a ramp deck feels like it is likely to want. Obviously, it's not itself like going to win you the game, but if your opponent like doesn't answer this immediately, you generating multiple big threats off of it, and that can be a very powerful tool to win a kind of attrition style game. So it's mostly a matter of being able to have enough stuff so that your opponent can't actually just like answer all your things when you're spending the rest of your resources on ramp. And crucially, 7 is a pretty key cost, because if you Wild Growth or Overgrowth rather on 4, you then hit 7. So that's like a flashpoint of mana that's actually going to be relevant. And I think part of the reason we see if you have 7 mana, you could also use this with Ironbark, to kill larger things and keep it alive so you can get more attacks in, because, well, you have 7 mana if you played this. So I actually think this card is much better than it thinks, much better than it seems on the surface, because it's kind of all these things that a ramp deck wants. It wants an answer that it can ramp into, that also, gives you additional threats when you're spending your resources for ramping. Next up, we have Bog Beam. Deal 3 damage to a minion. Costs 0 if you have at least 7 mana crystals. I feel like this is another like very powerful and auctioneer style deck card. And I feel like we very, very well may see like the auctioneer Kael'thas style of Druid with like this and Ironbark. You ramp up and then you're like, okay, I get to kill your thing, drawing cards. And that feels like it's going to be very much an archetype in Druid. I feel like this is also like a card that I could see just playing in a ramp style of deck, because be able to kill things while playing your sort of threats once you actually start ramping can be one of the things that Druid can struggle with. Like if your opponent like makes a like sizable board and you're like, okay, I can kill one thing. They're like, okay, my other things attack you. Being able to play like your Marsh Hydra, Bog Beam something, maybe even Bog Beam 2 things to help like actually get tempo back and swing back toward you. One of the big problems though is that, again, like if you have a critical mass of ramp effects to get you to your big things, you don't have that much room for stuff like this in Ironbark unless your deck also has a bunch of card draw. So that I think is the biggest question mark to me as to whether this sees play, because in that ramp style deck outside of the like auctioneer style deck. Maybe those are just the same deck. Maybe there's a ramp deck that also has auctioneer and looks to have the ramp effects into the big minions and then just auctioneer to find your ways to end the game. Next up, we have Glowfly Swarm, 5-cost spell. Summon a 2/2 Glowfly for each spell in your hand. This is obviously a finisher style card for a Fungal Fortunes deck, and this can make a lot of stuff, right? It could be 5-cost, basically like make 5 2/2s, or even like 7 2/2s, and that I think is a very potent card in like any kind of swarm deck, any kind of deck, even like a spell based like ramp deck in some capacity. This can just be a way that you aim to fight for the board sort of in the mid turns. The problem with that is in a metagame where like people are playing a significant amount of AoE removal, unless you have multiple waves of stuff like this, that you're not necessarily going to be getting enough sort of threat from any given one of them. So you may need to be playing this in a deck that has like a bunch of other token generators like landscaping forest aid type stuff. And in those right now, at least, those feel like they want to be more tree focused. So I don't know if that's necessarily going to be the same deck. But you could easily have a spell based deck that's like ramping out to some degree, using Fungal Fortunes, using Glowfly Swarm, along with a lot of the other token stuff in kind of a different shell. Next up, we have Archspore Msshi'fn, who is a 3-cost 3/4 taunt with Death Rattle. Shuffle Msshi'fn Prime into your deck, who is a 9/9 taunt, who also summons a 9/9 giant with either taunt or rush. Crucially, I've seen some people mention you could use this in like Quest Druid and get 3 9/9s for 10 mana. It doesn't work that way, from my understanding. What it is summon a 9/9, give it taunt, give it rush. So you don't get the extra 9/9. It's just whether that thing has that keyword. So this I think is a just not really a card that goes into like an archetype per se, because it's just a reasonably sized taunt body early, and then a big thing late. Obviously doesn't go into like an aggro deck, but it's not like you play this necessarily because like your ramp deck, right? You don't have to be a ramp deck to use this, because you at least are getting the small portion first, and it's just like, okay, well, this ends up being, say you're a mid range deck. It gives you the small thing, and then you have the large version shuffled into your deck for later, which you usually won't get to until you have a bunch of mana anyway, because it has to be shuffled into your deck and then drawn again. So I think this is just a solid, just overall a solid card. Again, I don't really know necessarily where it goes. It could easily go into like Highlander Druid or something, where you're just looking to have generally solid stuff, or really, again, kind of any deck that isn't super focused on a particular strategy. I wouldn't play this in, say, the auctioneer type Druid deck that I'm talking about, because you don't want to have non-spell cards in your deck. You don't want to have things that you cycle into with your auctioneer that you can't do anything with. But can be very impactful pretty much anytime you actually draw both halves.